What's going on, everyone? And welcome to another episode of Writing Friction. And as always, today's guest is pretty cool. Everyone say hello to Simon Hahn. How are you, Simon?
I'm doing well. Yeah, it's already 10 a.m. here, but it feels earlier for some reason.
I feel you. Yeah, no, since I've been doing this podcast on the West Coast, a lot of authors don't live on the West Coast. So I've been doing this at 7 a.m. I did one
Oh,
at 6:30 a.m. And I wonder, like, can people see it in my face? But it's fine. It's fine.
oh, I thought maybe you're on the East Coast. You're ahead of me because you
Oh,
seem
yeah, no.
very energetic.
Yeah, no, I'm in San Francisco. Well, just before the podcast, we were talking. Reba, my bulldog puppy, is behind me. So life has altered in the sense that I'm up at like 5:45 in the morning now.
Okay.
Well, that's when I write too, though. I write before work. When do you write?
Um, it's hard to say this year, but typically I try to keep a sort of standard schedule. Like I was lucky to have this fellowship where I could write almost full time the past couple years, and so I get up around 8 or 9, and yeah, right around this time, like 10 a.m. and try to write for like these 2 to 3 hour blocks. Of course, I'm not really writing that whole time, but I'm
Yeah.
pretending to half the time.
Uh huh.
And then, taking breaks, sometimes reading, walking around, eating snacks.
Well,
But
real quick, you said fellowship. What was the fellowship you were a part of?
it was an artist fellowship in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So
Okay.
that's where I was for the past 3 years. And it was fairly new, but it was pretty big. It was like 40 different writers and artists across all different mediums and from everywhere in the country. We were all just living downtown in Tulsa, and it was great. I wrote most of my novel there.
Uh huh. I guess we'll back up the track a little bit. You are originally from China, correct? And you grew up in Texas.
Yeah, I was born in Tianjin, China, and then I moved to the States when I was one.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So I mean, pretty much right,
Pretty
fresh.
much.
Okay.
Right.
And you spent your whole life in Texas.
Up until I was 18, and then
Okay.
this is actually the first time I've lived here for an extended amount of time. My parents live here, and my wife and I are actually supposed to go to San Francisco. That's
Oh,
where we're
okay.
planning to move.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah,
Oh, cool.
she's a
Awesome.
grad student around there, and but her classes are all online.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So rather than pay rent there, we figured we just live with my parents. So
Yeah,
that's really
okay. Well,
good.
the rent is dropping. That's the only thing you hear about nowadays. It's the only conversation people
Okay.
want to have. That's pretty cool though. I mean, I've been to Texas a bunch. I've been touring in bands forever. So I've been to South by Southwest probably 4 or 5 times playing in bands. But Texas is we talked to Kimberly King Parsons. I don't know if you know her. She's from Texas too, and
Yeah.
she writes about Texas. It's one of those places, I feel like lends itself well to being written about. I feel like a lot of people in America have actually never been there. Could you talk more about kind of how that influenced your writing? I'm assuming do you write about Texas? Is it a big part of your identity at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because I mean I grew up in a very specific community in Texas, and that's the thing that people who've never been to Texas don't realize is it's obviously a huge state. So depending on where you are, it's like being in a different state depending on geography. But
Sometimes country.
country, yeah, or Texas would like itself to be its own country or something. But so I grew up in for the most part, I mean, College Station, Houston, but then for the most part in the suburbs,
Okay.
and that is sort of Plano, Texas, also the setting of my novel. And uh, there was a huge like Asian immigrant population there. There's a lot of like unique weirdness about the place that I think people don't really think about when they think Texas. I remember I did my MFA in Nashville, and when I talked to people about being from Texas, was almost like an oxymoron to them. They're like, in Asian Texan, is that a thing? But it is like there's a huge,
Well, it's America.
it's America first of all, but
Yeah.
also the Texas that exists in our popular imagination, like in a McMurtry novel or something, which I mean I love McMurtry, but it's that's a very different part of Texas than where I grew up, and it's also a different time.
Yeah.
And Texas like is interesting because it's so mythic, and yet people live there. They have very everyday, sometimes mundane lives there, and so I'm always interested in kind of pushing back against the myths a bit.
Yeah. I mean, well, you were talking about that, and you said people's ideas of Texas. I thought of King of the Hill. Because people think like, like things like that. Cool. So you mentioned that your first book, it is called Nights When Nothing Happened. Can you talk a little bit? This is your first book, right?
Yep.
Talk a little bit about the book, but also talk about leading up to that book. How did you start writing? Were you writing, short stories, essays, things like that, or did you just pop out a novel and now I'm a writer?
Definitely did not just pop out. It was about 6 years from beginning to end. But yeah, I mean, Nights When Nothing Happened. It is set in Plano,
I'm
Texas.
sorry, 6 years from when you started the novel until when you kind of finished it?
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, so the book it's set in the early 2000s in Plano, Texas, and it's about a Chinese immigrant family trying to settle down in the suburbs, but they all kind of have very unique circumstances for getting there, with like kind of secrets and fears and longings that they're keeping to themselves. But that all kind of comes out to the open when their little girl Annabelle begins to sleepwalk, and that kind of sets off this chain reaction of misunderstandings. And so that's basically what the book is about. And then as far as how I got there, it yeah, I mean, I started writing short stories. And I still really love writing short stories, and this book started as a short story.
Oh, it did.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And I think it was so this book is alternates in four different perspectives, each member of the family. But the story was just Jack, the boy, one perspective, and it had this whole complete arc and everything. But I just kept thinking about it because so much of that story was dependent on each character's relationship to one another and the ways they kind of intersect and then the ways they kind of miss each other. Um, and so I realized that was the story I really wanted to tell. Like I wanted each character to exist in relation to one another. And because of then I realized, okay, I need to explore each perspective. And
You're
then
like,
the
oh shit.
story, well, I was excited. It was kind of exciting because
Yeah.
I just didn't I felt like I didn't have the space in my head for a novel back then. And
Well, back then, how long? This is 6 years ago, or when did
yeah,
you?
yeah, it's like
Yeah.
2013, 2014-ish.
Well, when did
Uh,
you start writing originally?
Originally, well, I guess I've always, I mean, as a kid, I would like write, but I think I went back to it more seriously in college.
Uh,
I just took a couple classes for fun, and then I just took like another one, and then another one, and then I was like, I guess I should just like do this more. And
okay.
um, yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is I never thought about writing as a profession. It just didn't. I didn't have a framework for even imagining that as a thing. And but then when I realized I could do it in school, like I don't know, like school was something I kind of understood, and so uh, and 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 I discovered there were like these graduate programs where they're fully funded. They even give you a stipend. So I thought, why not?
Yeah.
And by the time I was done with that, I felt like I was in too deep, and I had to just keep doing it.
Kind of like Birthright Israel. But yeah, so going back, so were you reading a lot as a kid though? I mean, there are mechanics that you have to build as a writer. I'm a fairly new writer, but I've been reading since I could open my eyes. And the reason I started writing was because it was the same. You could see the guitar behind me, and the reason I started playing guitar and playing in bands was I'm like, well, other people did this. Why can't I do this too?
Yeah,
So when I started taking writing seriously, that was just what I told myself. I'm like, well, all these people started the same way I did, just with an idea. And then it's getting down to it. So were you reading a lot as a kid? Were you reading in college? Do you have time to read?
oh yeah. I don't think you can really be a writer unless you read. I think that I mean, definitely as a kid, I was a big reader. I can't say that my tastes were super sophisticated. I was like a big fan of like Animorphs.
Okay, yeah, hey, it's all good. I was a big James Patterson guy.
Oh yeah, yeah. And but I mean, I read a lot, and then there was a period in like middle school and high school where that reading really dropped off. I think I became more interested in like video games and stuff,
Yeah,
which is another form of storytelling, but maybe not
definitely
so much
is.
the games that I was playing. Um, but yeah, it was. I always knew I liked to do it, but again, it was that what you were mentioning about how how if other people are doing it, I could do it too.
Hmm.
That didn't really occur to me because I knew like ostensibly there were writers in the world, but they were like astronauts to me. They just weren't like it wasn't a thing that felt concrete.
Yeah.
So it really was in college where the my love I kind of rediscovered my love for reading, partly because I discovered like writers that I never heard of before, but were actually fairly prominent. I just didn't think to read.
Anyone specific?
Yeah, I mean, like one a writer that a professor introduced me to was Gish Jen,
Oh,
um,
okay.
one of the early Chinese American writers that I read, and I'm trying to think. I mean, and I also read writers like Faulkner and Toni Morrison, and
Yeah.
but to encounter them when you're like sometimes when you encounter writers like that too early, like in high school, and they're just these assigned readings, you just don't have the same connection.
I talk about it all the time and it drives me insane. The books that they ask you to read in high school are I recently reread the of Mice and Men.
Mhm.
And when you read that as a 33-year-old man, it's a lot different than when you read it as a 13-year-old boy.
Yeah.
Also like The Old Man in the Sea, or like why are they trying to have high school kids read Siddhartha? It's like there are things that, there are other books that can replace these books that would be so much more influential for that age. And I agree with what you're saying. It's like sometimes you read these books and it's at a time of your life where it's just right over your head. Like 17-year-old kids trying to read like Moby Dick. It's crazy. It's crazy. Well, that's cool. I mean, that's cool that you were able to trust that feeling of, well, people have done this before. I can do it too. Do you remember that first time you actually sat down and typed away or wrote those first like serious words?
Hmm. That's a good question. I yeah, I mean,
I want the date, the time, what you were eating.
yeah, I guess yeah, it depends how you define serious because
Yeah.
even so when I first started writing short stories, it was they were assignments in class,
Yeah.
but it felt more serious because people were discussing them. They had to, it was part of the class, but it was like a text that
Mhm.
people like had some kind of relationship to, and that was really powerful actually. Like I think that's there's a lot of drawbacks to the workshop model, and we can talk about that later, but like I think that one thing that helped me was that just it became writing was a private thing, but it's also communication, and I saw that my words were communicating something to
That's
people.
an
And
interest. That's a very cool thing to use. You just said
yeah,
how it's so intimate, but you're able to put it out there and then get that. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so I remember I like wrote a story, like I don't know, as a sophomore or junior or something, and it was like it was very like mundane story. It was like about uh a couple, like I think they were going to like they were planning to have sex for the first time. They're in high school, and they were very awkward about it, and they're at a Walgreens, um, buying a condom for the first time.
Yeah.
They don't know how to navigate that,
Yeah.
and that was the whole story. It was about how to like buy this condom.
Okay, for sure.
But yeah, and people really liked it in class, and I remember my professor was like, this is a kind of story that shows you can write about anything, and
Hmm.
it can be interesting. And I think somehow I that lesson has stayed with me, because my book is very much about like everyday lives as well.
It's authors can write about that well, and authors can write about that not that well. Everyday life is an interesting thing. I write about everyday life, but I put a little more. I'm over the top in the humor. And when
Mhm.
you're over top with humor, things have to be a little more out of bounds. When it comes to being in that real world. But it seems like you kind of narrowed it down. So you're in college, you're doing this, you're in the MFA program. I got to get back to what you said though about the workshop thing.
Yeah.
Um, I've talked to authors and they swear by it, and I've talked to authors where they thought it was detrimental to their work. Um, Talk about what you were gonna say before you didn't say
Uh,
it.
well, I'm also a teacher now,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
so I can't completely write it off because I
Of
teach it.
course not.
But I I mean there are definitely limitations, right? Because you have what I've what I've kind of see happening is it's a structure that like tends to invite a kind of group consensus, right? Like, and I find that sometimes people who don't agree with the group just don't talk because they feel like they were wrong or something, like they interpreted the story wrong. And then when you have a book out in the world like I do now, it's just you realize that is just not how fiction is received in the real world. The workshop is trying to simulate that a little bit, but it's a very like protected, almost curated space. Um, and so it's trying to understand that, and there's also these kinds of uh, various quote unquote rules of workshop where, for example, the writer can't speak, which again I understand where that's coming from because I can't like hover behind the shoulder of every reader of my book and explain things. Um, but then you have sometimes what I've realized, like your book is also it's not necessarily for everyone. You're trying to find the right readers for the book, and sometimes the reader in your workshop is not the right reader, and they're trying to make your writing something that it's not, or something that it shouldn't be. And then when you're kind of muted like that, you can't really show them what you want the story to be. So it requires a level of trust and a level of humility on the writer side, but also on the reader side to sort of center the story's goals, and that's not always easy to do.
Well, you said a lot of things there. One being, you don't know how your work's going to be perceived by the 7+ billion other people that exist on this planet, right? So yeah, like when I've never been part of a workshop, and that makes complete sense when you're saying, you're getting restricted feedback in a very isolated area with someone who you like you said you can't speak to. It sounds like Fight Club. And yeah, but so did you have to? Were you able to? I mean, you were able to express it, so obviously you're cognizant of it. But in the beginning, were those critiques or praise of your work, did that influence how you were writing early on when you first started those workshops?
Yeah, I think when I first started, yeah, a couple points on that. I got in the trap that a lot of people do, where you feel like you have to answer every single critique in some way, right? Like it's almost like a checklist. But that obviously doesn't work because sometimes the critiques contradict each other, right? And what I've grown to understand about it is that people are just kind of offering like little windows of opportunity into your work, and they're asking questions or proposing solutions that maybe you hadn't thought of before, and now you can think about it and
Mhm.
you can decide not to do it, right?
And
but
be open to that.
but you can be open to that. You can consider something that you never considered before, which is helpful. But the other trap that I've gotten into is like when people seem to unanimously praise something in the work, or you have a particular reader who's just like so passionate about a particular sentence even, or a detail. For me, in when I'm drafting later on, I'm like, oh, I can't cut this ever. Like I have their voice in the back of my head. But sometimes you have to. Like
Yeah.
for this novel, like I had to cut some scenes that I really felt attached to, and that early readers really loved, and I felt like I was almost like betraying them or
Oh
something
yeah.
by cutting it. But the story evolved and it changed, and maybe what I cut will be in a different story one day. But sometimes you have to just let let things go. You have to understand the bigger picture.
It's funny you say that. I mean, I'm the same way. If I'm trying to finish up my first novel and I'm sending out little chunks to people, and when I get positive feedback, you're right. It's like I bookmark it in my mind. I'm like, I can't ever delete that paragraph because one other person liked it.
Right.
It's crazy, but talking about that, there's a level of doubt with that. There's a level of insecurity, but there's also a level of just trusting your gut. Um, are you a big, I mean, you said 6 years to write the book. Are you a big draft guy? Are you, constantly just tossing shit out, moving shit around? Or was it kind of just like, boom, 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 I'm gonna, here it is?
I think revision was the biggest part of it. I have, my process is really inefficient, but I'll also revise as I draft, right? Like, it's hard for me to keep going if I don't feel in the moment happy with the sentence, and so it's very slow. Sometimes I get some momentum. That's my goal, is to get to a point where I'm like just writing. I'm not thinking. I'm not, it just feels natural to me. But a lot of times it's not like that. It's a grind. And then after I do all that, like drafting slash revising, I look at the whole picture, and then I have to revise again, right?
Mm-hmm.
And with Nights When Nothing Happened, it was like around the 4 year mark where I got an agent, but then I worked on the book for another year with my agent, and then we sold the book, and then I worked on the book for another year with my
Well,
editor.
could you, all right. So if you got, can you talk about that process? Were you purposely shopping the book out to agents? Did you just happen to meet someone? And what was that process like?
So
Because you're talking to someone who got rejected 73 times.
oh, I also encountered plenty of
Oh
rejection
yeah, oh yeah.
from, I mean, so first, what I was doing, I was writing short stories, right? So I was submitting to journals, getting rejected everywhere. But I did have this lucky break with one journal, that, and then my eventual agent actually read the story in the journal, and she reached out to me.
Okay.
Uh, and at the time I was still working on the novel, but she had my name, she knew who I was. And then I think about a year later, I sent her the novel, and she
Mm-hmm.
decided to take me on. So yeah, that was the process of the agent. And then, did you ask another question?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I always compare it to the music business. With you have the publishers, the record label, the agents, the A&R person,
Yeah.
the writers, the band. So it seems to be parallel kind of ways the operation works. So you get the agent, and then you said it was another year, and then you had to work with an editor. So like with music, when these you pop out that record, you make the record, and then you go on tour, and that's your life. Talk about having to live another year working on this, because again, it's all up in the air, right? You don't know what's going to happen, but
Right.
you still have to motivate yourself to work on this book.
Yeah, you sort of, I tried to just tell myself that every stage was a kind of, I tried to be encouraged by every stage I got to. Like when I got an agent, I tried to feel encouraged by that, even though I knew the book wasn't ready, right? And I knew the ultimate goal was to have a book. But I think that's so much about, for better or for worse, it's like how writing gets put out in the world. Like as writers, we have to find our champions, right? Because so like the society at large doesn't really champion writing or writers, or and so especially in the stage where you can't say you have a tangible object to give them, right? When you just say I'm a writer, I'm working on something. That's what I was afraid to even call myself a writer for so
Yeah.
long. But when I found people who were calling me that and were thinking about the book as a real thing that could be in the world, that was really encouraging. Um, and so, but it was also, I think it was encouraging to find an agent who wanted to do that work, because, I think it would be easier for the agent to just take what I had and try to sell it because it's less work for
Yeah.
them. Right? Uh, but she wanted it to be the best version of itself, and same with my editor. When she took it, she took it because she liked what it was doing well, but it also, she wanted it to, she knew that there was something better a better story within that story.
Was that your first time working with a like professional editor?
Yeah, I mean, because it was the editor who accepted the book, so
Mhm.
um, that yeah, it was my first time. Since it's my first book, it's my first time working with an editor.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I before I've written some short stories. I've written and I wrote a novella, but when I wrote the novella, that was my first time working with like a professional editor, not someone who
Yeah,
took a college class editing work. It's amazing. I learned a whole bunch going through that process of just getting that first wave of notes back.
yeah,
And having to swallow my pride. And like we were talking earlier, like, if one person tells you they like something, that's great. But if I can tell myself I actually like something, that's the hardest part. And
yeah.
when I got that first wave of notes back and she was like, red lines through an entire, pages, I'm like, oh, fuck me. I'm like, what did I get myself into? Um, was it a pleasant process for you? I mean, this is your baby. This is your first book. I mean,
Yeah.
was it a pleasant process?
Oh, it was pleasant, but I totally hear what you're saying. It's I kind of go back and forth from like hoping when I send something to my editor, hoping that I should just come back to me and be like, everything is perfect, and let's just do it.
Yeah.
But that's just you know that's just not the case, and it's never the case. And I've learned to, especially line edits and things like that. They're just I've learned to really appreciate them, and there's something magical that happens when I apply those edits and then also bring in my own like interpretations of them and my own solutions. And then it takes time, but then I look back on it, I'm like, wow, this is it's like very, I don't know how to explain it. It's like this very uh, soothing almost feeling, like you've just sculpted something slightly more pleasing and aesthetically beautiful, and and you created something that you couldn't have imagined necessarily yourself. I think that's when an editor becomes useful, right? Because you've taken your story uh, to the point where you feel like you can't go any further with it on your own, because you are limited as one person. So when writing became this kind of collaborative process, it was nice. It was a little less lonely too.
Mm-hmm. Um, I think of writing differently than I think of other art forms. I'm looking at a painting on my wall, and I think of painting as starting with nothing and building up to something. I look at writing as starting with everything and taking it all the shit away. So you were talking about like a marble
Exactly. Yeah.
exactly. So it's always you're constantly. It's like you don't want to keep adding things. The idea in my mind is to get it all there and then take away stuff. And when you start taking away things, then you get motivated to add more.
Hmm.
And then the space is there. And that's what I learned through the editing process. When I got that first thing back, I'm like, okay, she's not taking away these things because of this. She's really adding room for me to. And once I read her notes, then I realized that. But she's adding, she's like, this could be like this. And I'm
Hmm.
like, oh, okay, well, I could write 200 more words now because I got rid of 500 words that didn't make any sense.
Right.
Yeah. So what are you working on now? I mean, are you always working on new things all the time, or is it just one project at a time?
Oh, I'm always working on multiple
Yeah.
projects.
Interesting. Some authors I talk to, they literally, if they're not, they could only do one thing, and if you even mention something else, they can't do it.
Well, that would be very stressful while working on a novel because
Oh
it takes
yeah.
so long. I had to feel like I finished something in the middle. So I would actually like write very short like flash fiction pieces at some
Okay.
point, because it was nice to just finish something. And but for now I'm actually going back to the stories. I can't say that I'm doing it like literally now because I've been so busy with like book stuff, but I hope to go
Yeah.
back to the short stories that I wrote before, during, and after the novel, and uh, to see how they're like talking to each other, and maybe see how they can become a book. I mean, I like them on their own, but
Yeah.
it's another process to make a book out of them.
Definitely. And I learned that just by doing this podcast. I write short stories, but then I'm like, none of these have any correlation to one another. And I'm learning that if you want a book of short stories, they have to make
Yeah.
sense. Yeah. Simon, this was such a blast talking to you. Can you let people know, are you on Instagram, Twitter? Do you do that stuff?
Yeah, I am. I'm on yeah, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter.
What's your handle? Do you know?
Okay, so for Twitter, it's Simon Xin Han, Simon XINHAN.
Yeah.
And then Instagram.
We'll put up the links if you forget. Don't worry.
Okay. Do
Yeah,
you want me to?
no, it's all good. No worries.
It's hard to like, yeah, say it out loud.
On my Twitter, the podcast is called Writing Friction, but
Right.
Twitter named my Twitter handle Friction Writing, and it's just been it's driving me insane. I can't. I'm not a Twitter guy. I'm more of an Instagram guy. Last question. I always ask this: where are people buying your books? What's your favorite bookstore?
Oh, great question. I mean, I would.
And it could be more than one.
Yeah. Well, I would love to shout out the bookstores that hosted me for events. Some of these bookstores I wish I haven't even visited yet. I wish I could. But so in Terabang in Dallas, Green Apple Books in San Francisco, Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge. Am I missing? Oh, and Magic City Books in Tulsa.
Love it. Simon, what a blast, man. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you, Michael.
All right, we'll see you later, Simon.
All right, take care.
Bye.